The Disney's hand-drawn animation full-length features. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, the Disney's company has been around for almost 90 years now, so in all that time there are plenty of opportunity to do good, to do bad, and to do ugly. Now, the reason I wanted to make this review is because hand-drawn animation for me, especially the full-length features, is actually one of my favorite medium. Just I think it really is a medium where the only limits are the artist's imagination, and you can just do whatever you want stylistically to represent the story you're trying to tell, or even just the simple emotions you're trying to express. There's so much freedom I don't think you find anywhere else, and the fact that it's hand drawn, I think, gives it a much more personal and a much more human feel than computer animation. So that being said, you can't really talk about the state of the current state, or even the evolution of hand drawn animation, without mentioning Disney. The two are indissociable. I mean, Disney was the first studio to actually make the first full-length feature hand-drawn animation. Also, just to clarify, I will only be looking at Disney's products, as in the full-length animated features. So not the shorts or anything like that, and certainly not any aspects of Walt Disney's private life or anyone else who ran the company, their personal beliefs and all that. So I'm led to understand that, well, especially Walt Disney had some pretty unusual views, if not dodgy views. But to be quite frank, I don't really care about those. I mean, unless they bleed out into the cartoons, then I will comment on them. But if they don't, well, whatever he believed is of supreme indifference to me. I just care about the body of work that his studio made. And just another limitation I'd like to add to this review on the sexism or even the potential racism you could pick out in the Disney animated features, not because I don't think it's there, but simply because I think it's been underlined so many times and the company has acknowledged it, for better or for worse. They've certainly tried to respond to it. And so in that respect, I'm just going to leave that be and focus on another aspects of Disney animation. So on that note, let's look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the hand-drawn, full-length animated features made by the Disney studio. Now, if you're going to talk about the work of Disney's hand-drawn animation, you really do have to take the time to talk about the good of it and the good that it's done for the medium. And certainly, when you look at their glory days and their first 5 years of doing full-length animated features, they really produced some excellent work that was, I think it still is, unparalleled in many ways. It is. Those cartoons are some of my favorite cartoons when I was a child, and they still are now. They are some of the best cartoons ever made. I think in terms of original animation, on the quality of animation, the quality of the storytelling, on the character studies, on the emotional levels that it's hit, those 5 years are undeniable heights of excellence I think Disney never really reached again. But also leaving those 5 years aside from 1937 to 1942, it is undeniable that the quality of the animation has remained constant, even though you could be dubious about their storytelling or their marketing. You look at the technical animation and some of the variety and the ideas they put in, it's always been very good. With new mediums, for instance, Disney was one of the first studios to start mixing in hand-drawn animation with computer effects, and they doing so to great success. I'm talking about the world of hand-drawn animation. I think Disney did a lot of good to it, in the sense that they were really ones that made it a serious form of art that popularized it in the form of full-length features, and they really made it into an actual film. And in that sense, they altered the landscape of hand-drawn animation for the better, and they altered it permanently. They were never as innovative with it again. They never took as much risks as they did in those early years. I think the reason they didn't take as much risks as they used to was simply because in the world of entertainment, innovative ideas, risky ideas, taking chances and doing something new is very rewarded with commercial success. I mean, they took one chance with Snow White and did something that hadn't been done before. But then when it comes to Dumbo, Pinocchio, and Fantasia, which are all great cartoons, very original cartoons, very good animation, they did not meet the same success at all. So after about a decade of not really releasing any true full-length animated features, Walt Disney himself started a pattern that I think will ultimately damage the studio greatly, and it's Cinderella. And that was really trying to capture the feel of Snow White, his previous commercial success, and it worked very well. The princess story is something that the Disney studio do quite well. They do have a sense of magic to it. But to me, that was the first sign that rather than do something original, they would rather revisit a formula that had worked in the past. And that really, if you started doing that as an artist, for me, you started to set out somewhat. And I think this is why, even though Cinderella in itself isn't a bad cartoon, this deserves to go in the bad category, because this was when, as a whole, the Disney animated studios started to go down in terms of quality. I definitely think that was the case, basically from the period of the 1950s to 1989, before the so-called Disney Renaissance. The studio was releasing, they released quite a lot of cartoons, and And I think they were, in terms of my personal liking, they were fairly hit and miss. I think the quality of animation did remain constant, though. There's that to be said. But I think in terms of storytelling, these ones really were just cartoons for children. So they were fairly simplistic. They were quite easygoing. They were sort of just bright and colourful, and they felt very safe, which again I think was part of the marketing strategy. Parents knew that with most of the Disney products of this the main era, basically from the 50s to the late 80s, you could just park your child in front of it, not bother really watching what he's watching, and the kid will be happy enough. And that was sort of what they sold, really, was just cheap nannies, I suppose. But that being said, they did vary their styles and their genres somewhat. I mean, it was nowhere near as formulaic as the great Disney set out, the Disney Renaissance, we'll touch on later. There still was quite a bit of creativity to them. They were trying to do new things. They weren't just telling the same story again. They were telling small, intimate stories, only a few characters, telling sort of more epic feeling stories with lots of characters. So there definitely was still a variety there. It just simply it was just never as good as Disney gloried is, and I don't think anything Disney will ever make will ever be as good as those glorious first 5 cartoons. So the thing to say in terms of the impact the Disney Animation Studio had on the hand-drawn full-length animated features in general was that it did start to create. It made up this unwritten rule that hand-drawn animation was something that was just for children. When that hadn't really been the case before. I mean, if you look at a lot of the shorts that were around at the time, they weren't necessarily just for children at all. But Disney really normalized that. And I think that did affect a lot of studios and a lot of the hand-drawn animation that was written. Non-Disney hand-drawn animation full-length features that were done were either very child-friendly or, in the case of the Batsky stuff, just provocatively unfriendly for children. Of course, there are a few exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, Disney's presence in the medium and the field of hand-drawn animation was just huge, and they really had an impact in that sense. And I think that impact is still being felt today, as it is. And that I think is something that Disney did do to the medium. And now the ugly. Unfortunately, the Disney Animation Studios released a series of hand-drawn full-length features that did not make that much money. This was a time to hand over the power to the corporate side of the business, essentially, and just fully sell out completely. And that's basically what they did. I mean, it's called the Disney Renaissance. The Disney Renaissance seemed to be the series of cartoons that were churned out essentially during the 90s. They all sort of had this big blockbuster feel. They were released one every year, pretty much. And they were extremely successful and made a lot of money doing it, and it had a huge impact on the brand. Now, personally, I consider the term Disney Renaissance to be very pompous, especially when you consider what it's a reference to, the great political, cultural, philosophical, and artistic movement in history, where during the Renaissance, the idea was after the Middle Ages, people would reach back to the classical eras of the Greeks and the Romans and sort of build on the knowledge of the ancients, and that's essentially what Disney claimed they were trying to do, is reach back to those great classical eras and sort of remake the old classic cartoons, which is not remotely true, really. I mean, the cartoons of the Disney Renaissance just recycled the same characters again and again and again. They had trashy, sort of very rude bodily function type humor, really annoying comic relief sidekicks, silly guest star cameos, annoying pop culture references, and these very over-the-top musical numbers are really just basically just to get someone's attention, just flashing lots of colours and making loud noises. It's sort of the adult equivalent of jingling a pair of keys in front of a baby to entertain him. That really is what those musicals feel like to me. So these things are nothing to do with the great classics. I mean, Disney just basically just lost all of its dignity and just basically said, we will draw what we have to draw and we will write the stories we have to write to get attention. A really good illustration of that is also the really shoddy, really poor sequels that they were churning out too, that started during that 90s period. And they just did sequel after sequel after sequel, and it was just, I mean, at least the big blockbuster cartoons felt like a lot of work was put into them. They felt like sort of a Michael Bay film, but these sequels were just cheap and lazy and really just milking a well-established name, essentially. If you're still not convinced, I mean, I think the sequels undeniably prove that during that 90s period there was a fundamental shift in the attitude of the Disney studio, because they'd always been commercial, but to sell out with such a lack of dignity as those sequels did had never been done before about Disney's animation. So I refuse to use the term Disney Renaissance because it is not the correct term at all. It was not a great homage to the classics of Disney. It was a Disney set-out. I mean, they were obviously always a business, but this is when when you watch these cartoons, you just get the sense that the marketing guys had more input in the content of the cartoon than any artistic, creative mind did. and it was annoyingly extremely popular. I suppose that's just how good marketing works. Selling out does work if you do it right. Again, there was a certain poetic justice though, because Disney was eventually punished for its own greed, I think, and people just got bored of it. And good, I'm glad that happened. And then you can see that Disney was really flailing around to try and get people's attention, especially with Hercules, which is such. Well, so Hercules is just a good example of them just flailing around, just trying to do anything they can to get people's attention, to try and make it seem like it's new. But what they weren't getting was that the core problem wasn't that they weren't gimmicky enough. The core problem was that the stories and the emotions and the characters and the plot just weren't there. They just didn't feel sincere. They just felt hollow. I suppose it's almost funny. There's cool amusement, I suppose, to it when they tried to re-release a new Fantasia. And that was literally just them trying to do the Renaissance, trying to prove that they still had the magic of the glory days of the 40s. And yeah, it's still nice. Fantasia was nowhere near as good as the original. I mean, it just proves that they just don't have it anymore. They don't have that sparkle. The thing is, as far as I'm concerned, I think the studio is done in terms of full-length hand-drawn animation, which is a good thing, I think, because of the damage they did to the medium over the years. In the 90s, you just get this whole creative wasteland in terms of hand-drawn animation, because Disney was the ambassador of the genre. They represented it, and they just sold out and lost all their dignity. Consequently, I think the medium of hand-drawn animation was also completely damaged, and I think no one really bothered competing with Disney because you couldn't really beat them at what they were doing, because they were setting out so effectively and so well. When you look at once the 90s were over and once this sort of cultural desert was crossed, other forms of animation did pop up and did start giving Disney a run for their money, and were even beating them at their own game in many ways. And there were forms of animation that were different enough from Disney's sort of Western hand-drawn animation that they could survive it, survive the great Disney set out, and they could still be original. So before concluding, I just wanted to clarify what I was saying about the main sort of blockbuster Disney releases of the 90s. Is that I don't actually hate them. What I hated is what they represented about the attitude of the studio. I mean, the films in themselves are eminently watchable. I can watch them the same way I can just listen to whatever the mainstream pop song or on the radio. They both just feel manufactured, and again, for a studio that had been so great, that's what hurts the most. I think if Disney hadn't had those glorious five first years, I wouldn't have cared anywhere near as much. But they had, and also because Disney studios, whether they like it or not, were the main ambassadors for the medium of hand-drawn animation. And I think for a very long time, especially as a teenager, I really associated Disney just with commercial, predictable crap. And I really just associated Disney with those 90s sellout years. And I think even Disney itself tries to associate itself with those sellout years for some reason. And you really see that with this whole Disney princesses thing that most people, and well, me included, if you say the word Disney, my immediate word association will be princess. So Disney princess has become this thing, or the princess type characters. They're really just more generic word for strong female leads, not strictly speaking princesses. If you look at the evolution of the Disney characters throughout the year, they only really created 3 princess type characters in the first 41 years of making full length animations, and then created 7 in just under 10 years. So yeah, for some reason, the Disney marketing division just really has decided that their sellout years are going to be the main years they want people to associate with their hand-drawn animation. And I personally think that's a mistake. I think it's important not to remember Disney as it would like us to remember it, but to remember the Disney animated studios for the good that it did too, and for the great cartoons that it produced, and for the pioneering work it did in terms of hand-drawn animation, producing a great quality of work, and really establishing hand-drawn animation as a serious medium that it is, even though they damaged hand-drawn animation afterwards. Before they actually damaged it, they had to establish it. So to sum up this review in one sentence, the Disney Animation Studio, from great artists to great businessmen.